The room was filled with an overwhelming silence, heavy and thick, as if the very air had stopped moving. He stood there watching her, unsure of what to do next. Her face, etched with a mixture of sadness and contemplation, seemed to be locked in a battle only she could understand. The soft flicker of a candlelight reflected in her eyes, but there was no spark, no sign of the hope they once shared. It was as if time had frozen, leaving him with only one thought, one question running through his mind. Asterisk, what can you do better than stay silent with her? Asterisk. In moments like these, words felt too small, too insignificant to bridge the chasm that had formed between them. The more he thought about speaking, the more he realized how inadequate language was. What could he say that would make a difference? How could he possibly ease the storm she was weathering inside? His thoughts swirled in confusion as he tried to understand why it felt as if every word he spoke only made the distance between them grow wider. He could have tried to comfort her, to fix whatever was broken, but nothing seemed to reach her. This was the challenge of silence, the space between thoughts, between words, between people. It was a silent battle of wills. He wanted to reach out, to take her hand, to show her that he understood her pain. But the more he thought about it, the more he felt like his presence, his attempts to comfort, might not be what she needed. So he stood there, quietly watching her, trying to make sense of the overwhelming pull of silence. He had heard of the philosophy of Stoicism before, the teachings of ancient philosophers like Marcus Aurelius and Seneca. Stoicism was about accepting what cannot be changed, finding peace in the midst of chaos, and understanding the limits of one's control. But here, in this moment, with her in front of him, it felt almost impossible to apply those teachings. How could he possibly remain calm in the face of such a deep emotional distance? What could Stoicism offer in a moment like this? Could it teach him how to stay composed in the face of silence? Could it guide him to understand her without speaking a single word? Was it enough to simply be present in her sorrow, even if he had nothing to offer but his presence? He thought of the words he had heard many times before. The obstacle is the way. In a way, this silence was his obstacle. His impulse was to fill it with words, with reassurances, with anything that might break the tension. But was that truly the right approach? Could staying silent be the better choice? The tension was palpable, and the quiet became deafening. She shifted slightly, her gaze now drifting away from him, as if searching for something in the distance, something that wasn't there. His heart ached seeing her like this. But then, in that moment of stillness, a realization began to form. Maybe the answer wasn't in doing more. Maybe the answer was in doing less. Maybe, just maybe, the real power lay in simply being present, in embracing the silence, rather than trying to fill it with hollow words. He thought back to the core of Stoicism, focusing on what could be controlled and letting go of what couldn't. Could this moment, this silence, be the very thing that would allow him to connect with her in a way words never could? As his thoughts spiraled, he found himself at a crossroads. To speak, to act, to break the silence would be easy. But the harder path, remaining silent and trusting in the power of stillness, seemed far more difficult. He could feel the weight of his own uncertainty. Was it even possible to show her he cared without saying anything at all? The tension grew as the minutes stretched on, with neither of them moving, neither of them speaking. His heart pounded in his chest, urging him to act, to reach out, to do something, anything. Yet, there was something in him, a whisper of wisdom, urging him to stay still, to observe, to trust in the moment. It wasn't just about her, not entirely. It was about him too. Could he let go of his need to fix things, to control the outcome? Could he find peace in the midst of uncertainty? Could he be the calm in the storm, not by speaking or doing, but simply by existing, by accepting things as they were? And as she turned her gaze back to him, her eyes locked onto his with a quiet intensity, he felt a shift. Something changed. She didn't need him to say anything. She didn't need him to offer her solutions or even comfort her in traditional ways. She needed him to just be there. In that silence, in that shared space, something unspoken passed between them. He wasn't sure what it was, whether it was an understanding, a shared sorrow, or the beginning of healing, but it was enough. But just as he thought he had figured it out, just as he began to accept the power of silence, she opened her mouth, and the words she spoke sent a chill through his spine. "I don't think I can do this anymore." And just like that, the silence shattered. The calm they had shared moments before, the quiet bond that had started to form, was broken. The question he had been grappling with now seemed even more complicated. What could he do in the face of that? What was the right response now? This was no longer just about stoicism. This wasn't just about the philosophy of silence. Now, it was about something far deeper, something that might change the course of everything between them. And as her words lingered in the air, he had no idea what to say next. To stay silent or to speak? What could he do better than stay silent with her? The answer wasn't clear, and now neither was the future of their relationship. The words hung in the air between them, sharp and raw. His mind raced, searching for a way to respond, but it felt like his voice had been stolen from him. He'd opened his mouth, but nothing came out. What could he possibly say in the face of such a heavy admission? She was standing there, her posture rigid, her eyes no longer meeting his. She had said the words, but he still couldn't fully comprehend them. For months now, they had been living in this strange space, an in-between that neither of them seemed able to escape. He had known her for years, but it felt like they had only really started to understand each other in the last few. They had been drawn together by an unspoken connection, something magnetic that neither of them had been able to resist. But now that connection seemed to be slipping through his fingers like sand. He looked at her again, and his heart ached. She was the woman he had once thought he would share everything with, the highs, the lows, the dreams, the fears. Together, they had weathered storms. Together, they had overcome obstacles that seemed insurmountable. So why did it feel like they were standing on the edge of an abyss now? Her words echoed in his mind. "I don't think I can do this anymore." His chest tightened. It wasn't just about the relationship. It was about everything that had led them here, the misunderstandings, the silent moments, the things they hadn't said but should have. The truth was, they were both guilty of failing to communicate. He had been so caught up in his own thoughts, his own world, that he hadn't seen how far they had drifted. Maybe, just maybe, he hadn't been the partner she needed. And as much as he wanted to deny it, deep down, he knew she had been silently suffering for a long time. He tried to speak, to form the words that would fix it all, but his mind was a jumbled mess of confusion and fear. The pressure was suffocating. He wanted to reach out to her, to hold her, to tell her that everything could still be okay, but a part of him wondered if that was just a fantasy. The damage, whatever it was, seemed too deep. She shifted again, her eyes finally meeting his. But there was something different in them now, something distant. The woman who had once been full of life and warmth, the one who could make him laugh even on the worst days, seemed like a stranger. In that moment, he realized how much he had taken her for granted. It was as if he had always assumed that she would always be there, waiting for him to come around. "Why do you think that?" He finally managed to ask, his voice quieter than he intended. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she took a step back, wrapping her arms around herself as if trying to shield herself from whatever she was feeling. The movement struck him like a physical blow. She had always been the one to comfort him, to reassure him when the world felt too heavy. Now, it seemed like she was the one who needed comforting, and yet, he didn't know how to give it to her. "I don't know," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's just, everything feels like it's falling apart. I can't keep pretending that everything is okay when it's not." Her words pierced him. They were a reflection of the same doubts and fears he had been battling with, but hearing them from her made them feel so much more real. He had noticed the little things, the way she had become quieter, more withdrawn, the way she no longer looked at him the same way. But he had pushed those thoughts aside, convincing himself that it was just a phase, that things would go back to normal. He had been wrong. But was it too late now? Had they already crossed a line they couldn't come back from? He took a deep breath and moved closer, trying to bridge the gap between them. We've been through so much together. I don't want to lose you. Her eyes flickered for a moment, and he thought he saw a hint of something, regret, perhaps, or longing, but it was gone just as quickly as it had appeared. She looked away again, staring at the floor as though the weight of her own thoughts was too much to bear. I don't know if I can do this anymore, she repeated, this time with more finality in her voice. He felt like the ground beneath him was crumbling. The words she was saying, each one felt like it was breaking off a piece of him. How could this be happening? How could they have reached this point when just a few months ago they had been so sure of each other? He thought back to the moments when everything had started to change. It hadn't been a single event that had caused the rift. It had been a series of small things, little cracks that had slowly spread over time. They had stopped talking the way they used to. They had stopped sharing their hopes, their fears, their dreams. The communication, once so effortless, had turned into something strained, forced. He had thought it was just the pressures of life, the work stress, the everyday challenges that everyone faced. But now he wasn't so sure. There had been a time when silence between them had felt comfortable. It had been a peaceful kind of silence, a shared understanding that spoke volumes. But now the silence was suffocating. It felt like a wall between them, keeping them from truly seeing each other. He had read about Stoicism before, of course, the idea that you must accept the things you cannot change and focus on the things within your control. But in this moment, the philosophy felt almost like an empty promise. How could he stay composed, stay calm, when everything he held dear was on the line? How could he find peace when it felt like the very foundation of their relationship was shaking? For a brief moment, he considered walking away, giving her space to think, to process. But that thought, too, felt wrong. Every instinct in him screamed that if he left now, he would never be able to repair the damage. They had already come too far to simply give up. Yet, as he stood there, looking at her, feeling the weight of her words pressing down on him, he realized how much he didn't understand. He had spent so long focusing on his own thoughts, his own perspective, that he had failed to truly see her pain, her struggles. She had been carrying her burdens alone for so long. Had he ever truly been there for her, or had he just assumed she was fine? The questions swirled in his mind, but there were no easy answers. Only the painful silence that stretched between them, growing heavier by the second. He could feel the walls closing in around them. Would they find a way out, or would the silence finally be the end of it all? The answer was nowhere to be found, and neither of them seemed ready to face what came next. The silence between them had thickened, like a heavy fog that neither of them seemed able to break through. He stood there, staring at her, his mind racing but his body frozen, unwilling to make a move. Her words echoed in his head, over and over, like a painful loop he couldn't escape. I don't think I can do this anymore. His heart pounded in his chest as he tried to process it. Everything had seemed fine just weeks ago, maybe even days ago. Sure, they had had their disagreements like every couple does. But this felt different. This was the kind of silence that came from a deep fracture, the kind of disconnect that wasn't so easily repaired. His hands clenched into fists at his sides. The more he tried to push the words past his lips, the harder it became. She wasn't looking at him now. Her gaze was fixed somewhere far off, as though she was staring through him, her mind lost in some distant place. She had always been so strong, so capable of navigating the chaos of life with a calmness he admired. But now she seemed adrift, like a ship caught in an unrelenting storm. It hurt him to see her like this, to feel so utterly helpless in the face of her pain. He wanted to scream at the universe, to demand answers, to know where everything had gone wrong. But he knew that wouldn't fix anything. He could feel the weight of Stoicism pressing down on him, urging him to accept what was out of his control, to let go of his need to fix it all. But how could he? How could he simply stand there and watch her fall apart when he knew he was the one who had contributed to her breaking? His mind began to drift back, searching for the root of the problem. Was it one thing? Was it years of little things that added up, like grains of sand slipping through his fingers? There had been moments, subtle shifts in their relationship, that he had brushed off as temporary. She had become distant, yes, but he had chopped it up to the pressures of their lives. Work, family, the constant noise of the world outside. They had both been so consumed by everything else that they had stopped looking at each other, really looking. He couldn't help but think back to the way they had met, how everything had seemed so simple and effortless. They had been so full of hope, so certain that nothing could tear them apart. But time had a way of revealing the cracks beneath the surface. It wasn't just her pain that he had failed to see, it was his own as well. The way he had neglected his own needs, his own desires, thinking that they would always be fine as long as they had each other. Now, the distance between them felt insurmountable, like they were standing at the edge of a cliff, and one wrong move would send them tumbling into oblivion. Her voice broke through his thoughts, soft but firm. "I just don't think I can keep pretending anymore. I'm tired. So tired of carrying this alone." The words cut deep, sharper than any physical pain he had ever felt. He had never thought of her as someone who was tired, someone who was struggling. She had always been the strong one, the one who kept everything together. But now, in her voice, he could hear the exhaustion, the weight of years of unspoken emotions, unaddressed feelings. The realization hit him like a wave crashing over him, threatening to pull him under. He had been so focused on his own battles, so caught up in his own world, that he had never once considered that she might be drowning in silence. He wanted to reach out to her, to take her hand, to tell her that he would do anything to make it right. But there was something in her eyes that made him hesitate. She wasn't asking for reassurance. She wasn't asking for him to fix everything with a few comforting words. No, she was telling him that she was done, that she couldn't keep living in a relationship where the silence spoke louder than anything they could say. He swallowed hard, his throat tight. "I didn't know you felt this way," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I didn't want you to know," she replied, her words heavy with resignation. "I didn't want to burden you, but now I can't keep pretending. I can't keep pretending that we're okay when we're not." The admission hung in the air like a confession, and for the first time in a long while, he felt the weight of the truth pressing down on him. He had been blind to the cracks in their foundation. She had been carrying her pain in silence, putting on a brave face while the world crumbled around her. And he, lost in his own thoughts, had failed to notice. "I don't know how we got here," he muttered, more to himself than to her. "It wasn't supposed to be like this." Her gaze softened for a moment, but it wasn't filled with the tenderness he longed for. Instead, there was a sadness, a quiet understanding that things had shifted beyond repair. "You don't have to understand it," she said. "I just need you to hear me now. I need you to hear that I can't do this anymore." His chest tightened, and he forced himself to take a step back. It was as though every instinct in him was screaming to make things right, to do whatever it took to fix this, to find a way back to the way things had been. But deep down, he knew that he couldn't change what had already been broken. He could only listen, only acknowledge the pain that had been there all along. The silence stretched again, and this time it felt more suffocating than ever. The quiet was no longer a shared space of comfort, but a chasm that divided them. He could feel the walls closing in, the weight of everything that had gone unsaid pressing down on them both. But as he stood there, helpless, he realized something else. Something that made his stomach churn. It wasn't just the relationship that was breaking. It was something deeper, something inside of him. He had been so focused on their bond, on saving what was left of their love, that he had neglected the most important thing, himself. His own identity, his own sense of self-worth. Somewhere along the way, he had lost sight of who he was outside of this relationship, outside of her. And now, as she stood before him, as the distance between them widened with each passing second, he realized that perhaps they weren't just two people who had fallen out of sync. Perhaps they were two people who had lost themselves in the process. He had failed to nurture his own well-being, his own sense of self, and in doing so, he had unwittingly neglected the very thing that had once brought them together: mutual respect, understanding, and connection. She wasn't asking him to save her. She was asking him to recognize that they both had been living in a shadow of what they once were, and he wasn't sure he could fix it, or if there was even a way to try. But he also knew one thing: if they were ever to have any hope of fixing what had broken between them, it would require more than just words. It would require understanding, healing, and the painful truth that perhaps they both needed to change before they could ever hope to rebuild what had been lost. As the silence pressed down on them, the question remained: could they find their way back to each other? Or had the fracture already torn them apart for good? The minutes stretched into hours, though neither of them moved. The air between them felt thick, laden with everything they hadn't said. The tension was suffocating, pressing down on his chest with each breath he took. His mind was clouded, his heart a battleground of conflicting emotions. He wanted to reach for her, to close the distance, but the words that had been left unsaid seemed to hold him back, like invisible chains keeping him at arm's length. She hadn't spoken for what felt like an eternity, and her silence was louder than any words could be. He wondered if she was even still there, if she was truly seeing him, or if her mind had already drifted far beyond this moment, far beyond the relationship they had built. Was there any hope of pulling her back, or had she already made up her mind? The weight of the uncertainty felt like a vice around his chest. "I don't know what to say anymore," he muttered, his voice breaking the stillness. It was barely a whisper, but it felt like a cry in the quiet room. He didn't know what he expected her to say. Maybe just a hint of reassurance, a glimmer of hope that this wasn't the end. But there was nothing. She finally shifted, her hands trembling as she wrapped her arms around herself tighter. The vulnerability in the gesture struck him, cutting deeper than any harsh words could. It was a silent admission of defeat, a sign that she had given up trying to fix things on her own. Her strength, once so unwavering, had crumbled, and now all that was left was a hollow version of the woman he had once known. "I don't think I can do this anymore," she repeated, her voice low, almost detached. It was the same words, but they felt different now, darker, more final. Each syllable felt like a nail in the coffin of their relationship. He could hear the exhaustion in her voice, the way the words seemed to drain the life out of her. She wasn't just tired of the relationship, she was tired of fighting. For a moment, he felt the ground shift beneath him. The world around him blurred, and for the briefest of seconds, he wondered if this was all a nightmare, if he would wake up and find that none of this was real. But the cold weight of reality quickly shattered that illusion. This was happening. This was real. He tried to steady his breathing, trying to gather his thoughts, but nothing seemed to make sense anymore. He had always prided himself on being calm in the face of adversity, on staying composed when everything around him seemed to be falling apart. But now, with the woman he loved standing before him, broken and distant, all his stoic training felt like a lie. What good was composure when it couldn't fix the cracks in their relationship? What good was control when it had led them to this point? "I'm sorry," he whispered, though the words felt weak, hollow. Sorry wasn't enough. Sorry couldn't erase the moments he had missed, the times he had turned away when she needed him most. Sorry couldn't undo the damage that had already been done. She shook her head slowly, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. Sorry isn't enough anymore. Her words stung, a painful reminder that no amount of apologies, no amount of words could take back the hurt that had accumulated over time. He had spent so much of his life believing that if he could just control his actions, just stay steady, everything would be fine. But he had been wrong. He had been blind to the reality of their relationship, and now he was paying the price. He watched as she wiped away a tear that had escaped her eye, her face a mask of quiet resignation. She wasn't angry, at least not in the way he expected. She was beyond anger. She was worn down, drained, and the worst part was that he could see it. He could see it in the way she stood, in the way her shoulders slumped, in the way her eyes avoided his. It was as if she had already checked out, as if she had already let go. The thought was unbearable. He couldn't lose her. He couldn't. The fear clawed at him, raw and visceral. It wasn't just the loss of her that terrified him. It was the thought that he had failed her, that he had let her slip through his fingers without ever fully seeing the pain she had been carrying. He had always been so caught up in his own world, his own thoughts, that he had never truly understood the weight of what she was going through. He had thought he was helping by staying steady, by staying strong, but what she needed wasn't steadiness. It was connection. It was vulnerability. It was him, fully present, with all his flaws and imperfections. But it was too late for that now, wasn't it? His stomach twisted in knots, and he felt the ground beneath him shift once again. This was it. This was the breaking point. She was giving up, and there was nothing he could do to change that. Nothing except one thing. The idea bloomed in his mind, a faint spark of hope in the darkness. What if he finally let go of control? What if, instead of trying to fix everything, he simply allowed himself to be vulnerable with her? What if, instead of pretending to have all the answers, he showed her the truth, that he was just as lost as she was? What if, for the first time in their relationship, they both let go of the walls they had built and faced the pain together? But that would require him to admit something he hadn't been willing to face, that he was afraid. Afraid of failing. Afraid of losing her. Afraid that, no matter how hard he tried, he might not be enough. And yet, as he stood there, the silence pressing in on him, he realized something else. The fear of losing her had kept him frozen, had kept him from doing the very thing that might save them. The fear had paralyzed him, and now it was pushing her further away. He took a deep breath, the weight of the decision heavy on his shoulders. He didn't know what the next step would be, didn't know how they would navigate the mess they had created. But he knew one thing. He couldn't let this go without trying. Not when there was still a chance. "I'm scared too," he said finally, his voice cracking as the words left his lips. The admission was raw, uncomfortable, but it was the truth. "I'm scared of losing you. I'm scared that I've messed everything up. But I don't want to lose you. I don't want us to end like this." Her eyes flickered at his words, her expression unreadable. For a moment, it seemed like she might say something, might finally break the silence between them. But instead, she just stood there, her face a mix of confusion and sadness. The air between them was thick with unspoken words, with the weight of everything they had yet to address. It was as if they were both standing on the edge, and the only thing that could pull them back from the brink was a leap of faith, a leap neither of them seemed ready to make. The tension was unbearable, and as he stood there, waiting for her response, the world outside seemed to fade away. This was it, the moment that would define everything. The moment where they either faced their fears together or let the distance between them consume them entirely. The words hung in the air between them, suspended in the stillness, but just as he thought she might finally respond, the sound of a door opening downstairs broke the silence. His heart skipped a beat, the tension that had already been building escalating further as his mind scrambled to make sense of the interruption. Neither of them moved. They simply froze, their gazes still locked on one another, the reality of the moment hanging in balance. A moment later, the unmistakable sound of footsteps echoed from the hall. His pulse quickened, and his stomach tightened in a way that had nothing to do with the conversation they were having. This wasn't a simple interruption, it was something else, something that neither of them had expected. His first instinct was to move, to go and check who it was, but the weight of her stare kept him rooted to the spot, his body unwilling to leave. Then, before he could say anything, the door to the room slowly creaked open, and a figure appeared in the doorway. A figure neither of them had expected. It was her brother. His presence in the doorway felt like an electric shock, sending ripples of tension through the air. Her brother, the one who had been out of town for the past few months, was suddenly standing there, staring at them both. There was something in his eyes, something cold, something unreadable, that sent a chill down his spine. She looked at him, her face a mix of surprise and fear, and for a split second, it felt as if the world itself had shifted. Her brother had always been a distant figure in their lives, someone who had never quite seemed to approve of their relationship. But why was he here now, standing in the doorway like this, at this exact moment? "Lena," he said, his voice steady but tinged with an unfamiliar sharpness. He didn't acknowledge him, not even with the slightest glance. It was as though he didn't exist in this space anymore. "I need to talk to you." The words hit him like a cold wave, and for a moment he wasn't sure if he should stay or leave. He couldn't bring himself to move, though. Something about the situation felt off, more than just the tension between him and Lena. There was something deeper, something that seemed to have shifted in the air the moment her brother entered the room. It felt like a new chapter had opened, one that neither of them had seen coming. Lena's face tightened, her eyes flickering between her brother and him, before she finally nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "We were talking." Her brother didn't flinch. He simply took a step forward, his gaze never leaving her. "Now isn't the time for this. You need to hear what I have to say." He felt a cold knot twist in his stomach. The sudden appearance of her brother felt like a wrench thrown into the gears of everything they had been dealing with. He had been so focused on their conversation, on trying to fix whatever was broken between them, that he hadn't even considered the possibility that someone else, someone from her past, might be standing in the wings, ready to rewrite the narrative. Lena's eyes softened as she looked at him, her lips parting as though she were about to say something, but she quickly turned her attention back to her brother. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice tight, almost pleading. He stepped into the room, closing the door behind him with an unsettling calmness. His movements were measured, deliberate, and it only heightened the sense of unease in the room. "You need to know the truth," he said, his voice colder now, more authoritative. "The truth about what's really been happening." Lena's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with alarm. She seemed to recognize something in his tone, some underlying threat that had her immediately on edge. The air grew thick, as if the walls themselves were closing in. He watched, barely able to breathe, as her brother's words cut through the space between them like a knife. "Your boyfriend," her brother said, turning his cold gaze to him for the first time, his words laced with accusation. "He's been hiding something big, and I think you deserve to know what it is." Lena's face drained of color, her eyes darting between them, clearly torn. "What are you talking about?" she demanded, her voice shaky. "What does he mean?" Her brother ignored her, his eyes narrowing as he stepped closer. "Don't listen to him. He's been lying to you." The words struck him like a blow, a punch to the gut that left him momentarily speechless. He didn't know how to respond, didn't know what to say. For a second, everything felt like it was slipping away. Was this some kind of game, a twisted scheme to break them apart? Or was there truth to what he was saying? Lena was visibly shaken, her body tense with fear and confusion. "Stop," she whispered. "Just stop. I don't want to hear this. What's going on? What is he talking about?" Her brother paused, glancing back at her, and for a moment there was a flicker of something dark, crossing his face. He seemed to hesitate, as if weighing the decision of whether or not to reveal whatever it was he knew. The silence that followed felt like a slow countdown to something catastrophic, the kind of moment where everything could change with a single word. And then he spoke again, his voice low, almost conspiratorial. "The truth is, he's been seeing someone else, someone you don't know about." Lena recoiled, her eyes wide with disbelief. "What? No, that's not possible," she whispered, shaking her head in denial. But her brother was relentless, his words pouring out now like a flood. "He's been seeing someone behind your back. I know it, and I've got proof." The room felt like it was spinning, the air growing thick with accusations and uncertainty. He wanted to speak, wanted to deny everything, but the weight of her brother's words seemed to suffocate him, trapping him in a web of lies and confusion. Lena's gaze shifted to him, and for the first time, she looked at him as though she was seeing him for the first time, like all the trust they had built, all the love they had shared, was suddenly in question. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. His mind raced, trying to grasp the situation. Was it true? Had he really been hiding something from her? But he couldn't remember the last time he had lied to her, not in the way her brother was suggesting. Her brother stood there, waiting for her response, his presence like a shadow in the room, pulling them further apart with every passing second. And all he could do was watch as Lena's eyes shifted from hope to doubt, her world tilting as the ground beneath her feet began to crumble. The stakes had just been raised, and whatever fragile thread had been holding them together was now dangerously close to snapping. Lena stood there, frozen, her brother's words ringing in her ears like an unbearable drumbeat. Her eyes darted between him and the man she had loved, the man who had been by her side through so much. And now this accusation, this bombshell, threatened to tear everything apart. For a long moment, the room was silent. The air was thick with tension, and all he could hear was the pounding of his own heart. He wanted to explain, wanted to deny everything, but the words were stuck in his throat, suffocating him. He looked at Lena, her face a picture of confusion, hurt, and disbelief, and all he could do was stand there, feeling like the world was slipping away from him. Finally, Lena spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Is it true?" The question hung in the air like a sharp blade. He opened his mouth, his mind racing for an explanation, but nothing came. How could he explain this? How could he make sense of the chaos that had suddenly unfolded? Her brother was standing there, accusing him of something he didn't understand, but the fear in Lena's eyes made it impossible to ignore the gravity of the situation. "Tell me it's not true," Lena said, her voice trembling. The words felt like a punch to the gut. He wanted to deny it, wanted to tell her that everything was a misunderstanding, but a part of him knew it wasn't that simple. His mind flashed back to moments when he had been distant, when he had been so focused on himself that he hadn't seen the cracks forming in their relationship. He had been blind to the warning signs, too wrapped up in his own thoughts and fears to notice that she was slipping away. Could it be true in some way? Had his own behavior driven her to doubt him? I don't know what to say," he stammered, his voice strained. "I haven't been seeing anyone else, Lena. I promise you I haven't. I've been with you always." But her brother wasn't backing down. "You're lying," he said flatly. "You think I don't know? You think I didn't see you? I know what you're doing behind her back." Lena took a step back, her hands shaking as she tried to process what was happening. The tension in the room was unbearable, and all he wanted was for it to end, for her to believe him, for her to know that he had never betrayed her. But the doubt was there, like a cloud hanging over her, and he could see it in her eyes. "I don't know if I can believe you anymore," Lena whispered, her voice barely audible. The words struck him like 1,000 needles. He had never imagined a moment like this, where the trust they had built could be shattered so completely. He had taken everything for granted, assuming that as long as he stayed steady, as long as he didn't let his emotions get in the way, everything would work itself out. But now, faced with the possibility that Lena might walk away, he realized how wrong he had been. Her brother's expression softened slightly, as if seeing the toll his words were taking on her. He glanced at her, then at him, and there was something in his eyes, a flicker of doubt, maybe. But he wasn't going to back down, not now. Lena's gaze remained fixed on him, her face unreadable, the silence between them stretching out in painful waves. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she spoke again, her voice steady but filled with uncertainty. "I need to know the truth, all of it. No more lies, no more secrets." He closed his eyes, taking a deep breath, knowing that this was his last chance to make things right. He couldn't lie to her. Not anymore. Not when everything was hanging by such a fragile thread. "I've been afraid, Lena," he said quietly, his voice trembling slightly as he spoke the truth for the first time. "Afraid that I wasn't enough for you. Afraid that if I let my guard down, if I let myself be vulnerable, I'd lose you. So I buried myself in work, in distractions, in anything that could keep me from facing the fact that I was losing you." Lena's eyes softened, the anger and confusion in them slowly fading as she processed his words. It wasn't what she had expected, but it was the truth. She stood there silently, taking it all in, the weight of the revelation settling over her like a blanket of sadness. "I've never cheated on you," Lena, he continued, his voice growing stronger now that the truth was out. But I've been blind, selfish even. I've neglected you in ways I can't take back, and I see now that it's hurt you. I've been so focused on controlling everything that I forgot what matters, the moments we share, the connection we had, the trust we built. The room was silent for a long moment. Her brother's presence still loomed in the background, but his words were fading into the distance. This wasn't about him anymore. It was about them. It was about the truth they had both been avoiding, the fear that had been silently driving their actions for so long. Finally, Lena spoke, her voice soft, almost tentative. I don't know if I can just forget all of this, she admitted, her voice quivering. I don't know if I can trust you again, but I can't make any decisions right now. I need time. Time to think about everything. He nodded, understanding the weight of her words. He had no right to ask for her forgiveness, but he couldn't help the hope that surged within him. She wasn't walking away. Not yet. There was still a chance, however small, that they could rebuild what they had lost. I'll give you all the time you need, he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. I'll be here, whenever you're ready to talk, to fix this, because I know now that I've failed you, but I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make it right. Lena nodded slowly, her eyes never leaving him. Her brother, standing in the doorway, seemed to finally sense that his role in the situation was over. Without another word, he turned and left, closing the door softly behind him, leaving them alone in a room, in the silence of the aftermath. As the door clicked shut, Lena took a deep breath and looked at him one last time. I don't know what comes next, she said softly, but I'm not giving up on us. Not yet. And with that, the tension in the room seemed to lift, the weight of unspoken words and accusations slowly fading into the background. There was no resolution yet, no guarantees. But for the first time in a long time, they were standing in the same place, facing each other with the raw honesty they had been missing. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. Trust was fragile, and time would be the only way to heal the wounds they had inflicted on each other. But there was a chance. A small one, but a chance nonetheless. As they stood there, the world outside seemed to fade away. All that mattered was the space between them, the fragile connection they were now trying to rebuild. And for the first time in a long time, it felt like they might just be able to find their way back to each other.